ladies and gentlemen. I hope that whatever you're up to today, Sunday, that you're having a nice and pleasant day. As you're aware, I posted that I hope to put together a collection of flash stories from Sierra Leone. So, the Sunday feature today is going to take the form of a video, because I think that when people can see and hear what you say, they're more receptive to it. To begin with, I hope to collate about 25 to 30 flash stories from Sierra Leoneans. The first obstacle I have to overcome is that I have to get these potential writers to like and follow the platform. Once that has occurred, I hope to collect the stories, have a look at them, suggest where edits could be done, and send them back to the writers via email. But ladies and gentlemen, as you're aware, this sort of project, running it virtually, that's to say on the internet, and trying to engage Sierra Leoneans in particular, has a myriad of challenges. I left Sierra Leone coming up to 32 years now. So I haven't been on holiday, I haven't lived there for 32 years. And it was a different climate when I lived there. And so people need to first of all understand that if you want to participate in a project, you need to like and follow the platform so that you can have access to whatever I post, and so I'll be able to evaluate your strengths and weaknesses so that whatever writing tips I give will be tailor-made towards that category of people. Now, I'll say this because I'm going to do things differently this time. I have worked with Sierra Leoneans and we have co-authored 2 books. Therefore, what I want to do this time around, I want to look at your short stories January, February time, and I want to sit here laboriously, painstakingly going through that first draft and suggest where you can correct it. And the minute I come across people who can't write, I'm just going to delete them, because I'm not going to go through what I said again, writing behind the scenes on people's behalf, and then they take the credit for it. Yeah? So I had to say that. Okay. So a flash fiction, ladies and gentlemen, is a story that's between 300 and 1,000 words. I have asked writers to compile a flash story of only about 500 words. Now, that gives you a leeway of writing 450 or 550 words. I'll show you how you're going to count it. When you finish writing your story, you're going to highlight it. You're going to go to the taskbar and you're going to find where it says select all. So if you're sitting facing your phone, it would be on the right side of the screen. You'd go into your Word app and it'll be on the right side and it'll say select all. You select all the characters on the page. It should all be coloured black or whatever colour your default colour is on your Microsoft app. And then you're going to go to the left side of your page and you're going to look for where it says review. And where it says review, to the left side of the page, you'd have something known as word count. I will put a video up nearer the time to help you. And then on the word count, it should tell you how many words you have. Please do not go through the pain of counting your words individually. You're just going to give yourself a headache. So I would post video near at the time to show you how to count your words. And when you send in your piece, that's exactly what I do. I highlight it and I come up with the number of words. Now, the reason why I'm saying 500 is because if you're an emerging or novice writer and you're writing in a language that's not your mother tongue, you're going to struggle if you don't have access to a lot of books, if you don't have the internet, if you haven't done a writing workshop, if you haven't got a degree in English language, or literature, or linguistics. You might struggle to write a story comprehensively that's longer than 500 words. And I have seen that. Please do not think I'm being cheeky. So the very least I could ask is that you write 500 words. So when I look at your first story, if you're very good, I'm going to go back to yourself and I'm going to say, can I have a few more, please? Like I did with the book, What the Seashell Said to Me. So someone sent me that poem. I went, oh my goodness, please can I have a bit more? And I might give you £10 for that. I might give you £10 is about, I don't know how much it is in Leones, don't ask me. So I might say, well, because you're sending all this, I'm going to pay you for your submission. So I'll look at your first story, and if it's good, because some people are very good, and I should not put everyone in the same box. Some writers in Sierra Leone are very good, like you have Abubakar Mixese, that just turned up out of the blue, and he won a writing competition. Well, that everything that Usman writes turns to gold, and you wonder where Usman was all his life, that he writes so well. So you'll have people like this who everything they write, just all of a sudden, you lift it. It's just like exceptionally good. But those sort of writers are very hard to find because of the socio-economic problems that they have in Sierra Leone. People don't have access to the internet, so you can read a lot of contemporary stories and contemporary poems. So they're all writing the same way. They're all going, oh, Sierra Leone, personifying Sierra Leone as if she was a woman. They're not writing deep themes like you have, like Abubakar Mixese come up and wrote about when his parents used to spank him. And that's so good because it's an individual theme that's every young person in Sierra Leone can relate to, and you don't have people dealing with things the way that Yusuf Kamara did. So you have very few writers like Yusuf Kamara, you have very few good writers like Abubakar Mixese in that age bracket because they don't want to write themes that are relevant to them. You don't have anyone describing hunger the way you would see in a Nigerian poem where people are talking about food scarcity. They're going to town with it. You have people writing superficially where they're just writing something. It's scratching the surface. They don't have the richness of language that you'd have someone like Umar Farouk Sise has, because all of a sudden we have a lot of economical challenges where people, they're not going to sit around reading a book when they haven't got electricity. They haven't got enough data on the phone. So I have to bear in mind all these challenges. So a flash fiction would have fewer characters. When you're looking at building your characters, you won't have as many as you would in a short story. So you might stick with one or two characters. We are going to look at characters in detail when we get to that. So you'd also have to think of a plot. A plot is what we describe as the storyline. You'd have to think of the time and place of your flash story. If your story is set in Lone Star, I don't want to see you in the next paragraph telling me about what's happening in Bonth because you told me about Lone Star. So you have to stick to your time and place, except you change it with words. In a flash story, you might have to think of how you're going to write. If you're looking at complex settings, setting means like where you depict place and time. If you want to look at something complex, you have to think whether you have enough words. You might not have enough words. A flash fiction, due to its word count, does not change setting as frequently as in a short story. This is because with every change of setting, you have to use words to introduce the setting. Setting is only to say where the flash story, the scene where it's depicted. So my setting might be Lone Star, like I said, in my nice house in Lone Star. The plot is another thing we have to look at. The plot is a sequence of events, of things happening in the story. So the plot in a flash story, we start in the middle. Please do not give me a story that says, one day I woke up. That's not how we write flash stories. I would expect you to start in the middle, like, he went into the shop and all he could see was this writing on the wall. So a flash story starts in the middle. You assume that something has happened before. You do not start with once upon a time. You start in the middle, and then that's where you build up your introduction from. You start as if something had occurred before. So my first line might be, Jack walked into the shop with eyes as wide as saucers, and instantly his gaze became fixated on the writing on the wall that says, no Creoles allowed to participate in politics. Something like that. So that is the start of my flash story. Or it might be something like, Isata knew that as soon as she turned 8, her nan was gonna come to her mom and say, has she had that thing done to her yet? Isata knew the thing was what happened to her sister when her sister was 8, and what happened to her cousin when her cousin was 9, but Isata didn't know what the thing was. She knew that the thing involved cutting something that was between Isata's legs. Something like that. So that my story will then build up, and I'll start looking at circumcision. So we're going to start in the middle, and we're going to use words to explain the opening of the story. And I would look at a catchy or introduction as time progresses. So a flash fiction has a simpler plot, as it doesn't have the words to establish a complex plot. Complex means detailed. It means when a lot of subject matters are intertwined. Intertwined means I'll be talking about Isata getting circumcised on one level, and on a deeper level I might be looking at what's happening with young girls in Sierra Leonean society. So I might have a subplot, I might have a main plot. In flash fiction, you find it harder to do complex plots, so most people stick with a simple plot. A theme, as said, is the main idea or subject. So my theme might be circumcision, whereas I might have sub-themes, which might be the experience of girls growing up or something like that. But my theme is the predominant subject, where you would expect to have it reflected in paragraphs as the story unfolds. We'll talk about that, because I find a lot of Sierra Leonean writers that I've come across struggle to stick to one theme. A gentleman sent me a poem when I was collating poems, What the Seychelles said to me. Every stanza had its own theme. I was like, holy moly, what's happening here? How can you have one poem with so many themes? And by the end of it, reading what he sent me, I had a terrible headache. So one theme In a flash story, if you're as good as Umar Farouk, I would expect you to have 3 or 4 themes. If you're as rubbish as Bridget James, I'd expect you to have 1 or 2 themes only, because it's a flash story and you want to elaborate on your theme. So, we're also going to look at genres. You might say it differently depending on where you live. A genre is spelled Genres. So you might say differently depending on your accent or depending on where you acquired English. I say genre. I know some people pronounce it differently. Low fantasy. I don't have a lot of experience with fantasy stories because I sort of like the mundane and boring stories, which I'll explain in a bit. So a low fantasy is a fantasy that's primarily set in our world with some magical or fantastical elements to it. When you start going deeper, we call it a second world or high fantasy. And that's a fantasy set primarily in another world, including sword and sorcery. You might say, well, I have read a lot of stories, fantasy stories written by Africans. I'll let you name a few. Portal fantasy is a fantasy story in which characters travel from one world, usually ours, to another. You're probably thinking of Doctor Who now. And this genre bridges high and low fantasy. And you probably read fairy tales, often for children. These are stories in which a magical being or force propels plot or helps the protagonist. Now, the word protagonist is a noun for the main character. You might have been taught that they're called a hero or heroine, but because sometimes the protagonist is a villain, I prefer the word protagonist. So your protagonist is just the main character, because not all protagonists are good people. There might be a villain. For example, a myth. We have a lot of myths in Sierra Leone, and I would like to see how you translate these myths into your flash stories, because a lot of the myths that we have in Sierra Leone, they give a body to stories, and they make your story typically Sierra Leonean. So we have legends and fables, and there's the stories that explain the world through fantastical beings and gods. So I like to see how you write your myths, and I'm looking forward to collecting these flash stories, because we have a lot of myths in Sierra Leone. I also a lot of stories when I was a child growing up by my mom and dad. And then we have sci-fi, fantasy or horror stories. And you're going to start telling me now about Harry Potter, aren't you? And maybe there's some element of Doctor Who here as well, sci-fi fiction. Ideally, I want to see a sci-fi that doesn't racialize characters. So I want to see whether if you are in sci-fi, fantasy or horror stories, whether your protagonist can be a black Sierra Leonean or a black African, because often we don't have main characters that are ethnic. And then you have some stories that are set in the genre of magical realism. Post-colonial stories in which magical elements are normal and acceptable and accepted as a part of life. So I want to see how you write a magical realistic story. We have quite a few stories from Sierra Leone that are described as magical realism. Paranormal stories, if you like ghosts and stuff like that. Stories set in the real world with a fantastical element. These are sometimes quite similar to low fantasy stories. You might want to write a mystery. Now that's the hardest story to do. the hardest flash stories to do are mystery stories. If you're as old as myself, you probably read all of Agatha Christie's novels. You probably remember the Detective Columbo series on the telly. So the stories that are mystery stories have a sort of mystery, a puzzle central to the plot, and at the end of your flash story that is solved. Now, can I just say that you have to be very, very clever to do mystery stories. So I want to see if you're going to write a mystery, how you're going to do it. A thriller or suspense. Stories often mysteries, but are rarely straightforward. They rely on tension and keep you wondering what's going to happen next. Again, mysteries like thrillers and suspense are very, very hard to write. So if you're going to do a suspense story, I want to see how good you are at it. A noir, a dark fiction, is a nihilistic crime fiction, sometimes but not always told from the criminal's point of view. I'm going to give an example. An example might be when our dear friend Yusuf Kamara was writing about the dark days when he used to live in the slums. And a story from out of the slums came poetry might be described as a nihilistic crime fiction. Although most of it was non-fiction, if you're writing from that perspective, it might be described as a noir fiction. A Western, I don't think you'd find Western stories in Sierra Leone because primarily they're set in the American West, and there were popular stories that were set in the 1800s, of which a lot of films were made. A lot of Sierra Leoneans like romance fiction. Romance is typically the easiest to write. Stories in which love story is central to the plot and ends happily. I want to see you talking about different relationships now. I want to see relationships between people that have an age gap. And I want to see whether you write about same-sex relationships. I want to see whether you write about relationships from people from different countries. Make it a bit exciting. Let me see what you've got. You might want to write horror stories, scary stories that you read in the dark. I don't read horror stories in the dark. I read them in the light because I'm scared of the dark. I'm joking. So let me see if you can write a horror story about what happened in a rebel war. Let me see how you can fictionalize that. And lastly, you're going to look at Gothic stories. Stories, often horror stories, where the place is a character and there's a distinct set of foreboding. So, Gothic stories are usually once written by American and British writers. I don't think it's popular with African writers at all. So there you have it. Those are your different genres. And if you think I've omitted any one of them, ladies and gentlemen, please, when this video airs, please write a comment in the box, the comment section, and I might try and amend the video to include what you've said. Thank you very much.